Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching part 1 in Extra History series on Simon Bolivar. Now, I've always thought Bolivar was an interesting guy. I mean, he is the main leader of the Latin American Wars of Independence, and thus one of the main figures in the entire Age of Revolutions. And I always thought that Latin America doesn't get the attention it deserves when we're talking about the Age of Revolutions. A lot of that attention goes to France and America. So today we're going to do something to rectify that. We're going to be looking at the Age of Revolutions, particularly through Simon Bolivar. Now, before we get into this video, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Shots ring out in the Ohio Valley. A handful of militiamen under the command of a 22-year-old named George Washington have surrounded a
We're really doing the lead up to the Age of Revolutions. And yes, it all starts in the Ohio River Valley with a young George Washington.
tiny force of French colonials. Within 2 years, due to the interwoven alliances and secret treaties, this incident will spiral out into the 7 Years' War. The first truly world war, a war that would be fought on every continent besides Australia.
You know, I don't want to get into this too much, because I have yapped a lot about the 7 Years' War. You can find that in other videos, but some people do call it, the actual First World War. It was a war of a truly global scale, unprecedented. Not necessarily in terms of the number of people involved. I'm not necessarily talking about that scale, though, I mean, it was very large on that scale as well, but in terms of the geographical space it covered, because we were dealing with these sort of new-ish European empires that were beginning to span the globe. And, because this war was such a large scale, and it dealt with these expanding empires, this war was very consequential for Europe, America, for the whole world, frankly. I mean, it shaped a lot of history. It really shaped a lot of colonial policy, a lot of politics back in Europe. This was a very influential conflict. And if you're talking about, the Latin American Wars of Independence or the Age of Revolutions overall, the 7 Years' War is a good place to start. It's a bit of a precursor of everything to come.
And the dominoes fall.
They certainly did fall.
But as important and mind-bogglingly understudied as the 7 Years' War is, we're gonna just look at one of its repercussions, because its reverberations were felt around the globe.
Yeah.
This was the great conflagration between England and France. It was the conflict that had to happen eventually. But here in the States, we know it under a different name. We know it as the French and Indian War. We know it as such because that's the war we Americans fought.
Yep, the French and Indian War is the American theater of the 7 Years' War. The war that, in one way or another, led to the American Revolution, the French Revolution, like I said, the whole Age of Revolutions. Not to say that none of that would have happened without it, but it's pretty hard to imagine history without, or modern history, I should say, without the 7 Years' War. And I think they're right. It is somewhat, understudied, but maybe undercovered in popular history. There's a lot of attention given to the American Revolution, the French Revolution. I think there should be more attention given to the 7 Years' War.
But we didn't fight it alone. We were still a British colony back then, and the British sent thousands of troops overseas to help fight back the French forces coming out of Canada. By 1763, the war was over and peace had returned, but with peace comes taxes. After all, someone had to pay for all of those troops Britain had sent over.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the biggest consequences of the 7 Years' War is that it left a lot of these colonial European powers dead broke. I mean, because this war was of such a massive scale, they spent a lot of money prosecuting the war, and they were left very much without money following the war. And so these empires needed to get that money back. Of course, taxation is the main way to do that. Now, we can sort of see, honestly, well, there's a lot of different paths. You can look at a lot of different European powers, but we can see two different paths with France and England, right? France, in the 7 Years' War, had lost most of its colonial possessions. It retained its most important, which was Saint-Domingue, Haiti, as we call it today, but it had lost the majority, a lot of its colonial empire, And so it really struggled to make that money back, and essentially went into a financial crisis, the consequences of which was one of the factors that led to the French Revolution. Now, we look at Britain, they still had a lot of colonies, right? They had a lot of people they could tax. And so they started intervening more, taxing more, and that was one of the factors that led to the American Revolution. So we could see, however well off you were following the war, your actions could still lead to revolution. Good old revolution.
But a number of colonists didn't much like the idea of higher taxes, and they felt that the Boston Harbor really would be much better if it was tea-flavored. So they rebelled against the British. They were led by a 44-year-old man named George Washington, some relation. Now, those plucky colonists gave a good try of it, but they couldn't really throw off the world's greatest power without some help. So the world's other great powers, who wanted to give Britain a kick in the pants, mainly the French and the Spanish, said, "Hey, that looks fun. Mind if we join?"
Yeah, and you can bet that all of the money that France spent helping America rebel against the British did not help their financial situation. In fact, it made it a lot worse.
But now someone was going to have to pay for all those supplies and troops the French and the Spanish sent over to the Americans. So the French and the Spanish both implemented new taxes, both at home and, most importantly for our story, in their colonies overseas. So then the French revolted, and then the Haitians revolted, and then most of Latin America revolted.
Everyone was just revolted, man. I mean, you could see the pattern repeat. Of course, each individual revolution has its own unique causes and factors and etc., etc. I mean, they're not all 100% the same, but there are a lot of similar factors at play across these revolutions. I mean, this is why we group them together in the Age of Revolutions, or the Age of Revolution, as some call it, singular, right? Because there's sort of some people think that what we're dealing with is essentially one revolution, moving back and forth across the Atlantic and just manifesting in different ways. And some people think these are separate revolutions with varying degrees of connection. I mean, depending on which historians you read, you'll find different opinions on this. I mean, some don't even think it is an age of revolution. They think that's a bit of a misnomer. Some people argue there is little connection between these different events, though I don't think that's a very popular idea today. But regardless, I think most people agree there is some overriding event going on between all these different nations and colonies.
Because they, understandably, didn't feel like paying higher taxes just to, help make sure the U.S. didn't have to pay their higher taxes.
Right.
Because in the end, it all comes down to taxes. So there, now the stage is...
Well, yes, but also, I mean, there's a lot of debate over this as well. If you look at the case of the American Revolution, the question of why exactly did the Americans go into revolt? Was it economic, right? Was the tax burden simply too much to bear? I would argue not, because the tax burden imposed on them was not actually too burdensome following the 7 Years' War. I mean, it really wasn't that oppressive. I think there's a stronger argument to be made that it was more political, right? It was more the principle of the thing. What the colonists didn't like was the increased intervention that came following the 7 Years' War in the form of those taxes and more troop garrisons and the British Crown interfering in local government. So, in a sense, it's taxes, but I don't actually think that the sort of economics of it all is necessarily at the root of it, though perhaps in other ways. It's a very complicated equation. There have been hundreds of thousands of pages written on this topic, lots of debates had, but, there's clearly a combination of factors, and taxes do show up quite a lot. You can definitely say that.
Is set. Now we can dive into the life of the man who embodies both the glory and the tragedy of the Latin American revolutions, Simón Bolivar.
Fair.
1783. We're in one of the great houses of Caracas. On the lower floor, there's a celebration happening. All the leading people of the city are there. In the center is a man with eyes like a still lake, talking to the crowd. Upstairs, things are quiet. There's a woman lying in bed, holding a newborn child. The man is Simon's father. The woman is his mother. Soon they'll both be taken by consumption. Simón would not remember his father, and he would think of his mother less often than of the slave who raised him, Hippolyta. Simon inherited mines and plantations and slaves. The Bolivars were one of the first families of Venezuela, and
Yeah, like a lot of the American revolutionaries and a lot of the French revolutionaries, though, the French Revolution, we definitely have more of a mixed class dynamic. But like a lot of those other revolutionaries, Simon Bolivar came from one of these first families of his country, a wealthy, landowning, and slave-owning, as was often the case, family, right? I mean, when we look at the age of revolutions, what we call liberal revolutions, right? They were inspired by the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment. You might call them bourgeois revolutions if you're coming at it from a Marxist angle. A lot of these revolutionaries were what you might call middle or upper class bourgeoisie. Some of them were actual hereditary aristocrats, but a lot of them weren't. They did not. And of course, depending on where you're looking, you'll have different systems of aristocracy, right? This was, of course, more prevalent back in mainland Europe. I mean, you look at the French Revolution, you have some aristocrats participating in the revolution, but a lot of these non-aristocratic individuals. Regardless, some people who contributed did have aristocratic titles, but a lot didn't. Even those who didn't often came from a background of some means. Not always, right? There are examples of sort of working class or poor individuals who actually worked their way quite high in these revolutions, but a lot of these people came from at least middle class backgrounds, and Bolivar clearly came from quite an upper class background. And, he would not have been alone among other revolutionaries of the era. Of course, one of the exceptions to this would be the Haitian Revolution, where a lot of the revolutionary leaders were former slaves. Not all of them. Some of them were free people of color before the revolution who actually owned plantations and were pretty well off themselves, right? So even there, you'll find some revolutionaries of means, but in the Haitian Revolution, you'll have the exception where a lot of the revolutionaries came from slavery, right? So no ownership, no freedom, and they really worked their way up. But anyway, that's sort of a different story than the one we're talking about here, though it is related. Anyway.
He, one of the richest men in South America. But he wasn't a man yet. He was a child. And there was one thing that he didn't have: Spanish birth. In the Spanish colonial system, there were not only all sorts of deplorable hierarchies of race, but even for those deemed racially pure and white, there was a class system, with those born in continental Spain being more favorably looked upon than those...
Well, there was essentially a caste system that combined race and, to a certain extent, class, because, I mean, if you're you have two Spanish parents and you're born in Spain, two Spanish parents born in the colonies, that's not really a racial difference. I guess you could call it an ethnic difference. It's essentially a class difference, really. It's a social distinction. And so you had this casta system, where at the top, I believe, were the peninsulares. I don't remember all the terms, but we're talking about people born to white Spanish parents, born in Spain, right? That is right at the top of the pyramid. Bolivar, he wasn't quite at the top, but he was still pretty high up, which is he's born to white Spanish parents in the colonies. Now, that would have restricted him from some positions in government and military, and restricted him from some social opportunities, but he was still pretty high up the hierarchy. Though, I mean, if we look at these kind of revolutions, especially, say, look at the French Revolution, I think one of the things that spurred that revolution is you had a lot of sort of middle upper class individuals who were pretty high in the social hierarchy, but they were blocked off because of their birth. We see the same thing here. A lot of people who are very privileged, they have a lot of economic influence and power, but they are restricted, blocked out from some social, political, military, and economic positions, right? So Bolivar is kind of in that position.
Those born in the colonies. The highest government offices were only open to Spanish-born colonists.
Right.
But this bane wouldn't strike him yet. Instead, he grew up as an unmanageable and arrogant child. His father had died when he was 3, his mother when he was 9. The care of those in which he was left was sometimes excellent, sometimes negligent, but it didn't matter. He was always more interested in coursing the alleys of Caracas with the children of the streets than he was in studying or guidance. Finally, though, one tutor, while never able to control him, was able to teach Simon, albeit on his own terms. And so, as they rode through the fields or walked the streets of Caracas, this tutor imparted not a traditional education.
I wonder what this tutor taught him. I wonder if his teachings may have, I don't know, shaped the course of Simon Bolivar's life.
But his own personal loves. Rousseau, Locke, and Voltaire.
There you go.
Alas, even this was not to last, as Simon's childhood was set to a backdrop of revolts.
Though I will say, teaching him, these Enlightenment figures, while not a standard education, by the end of the 18th century, not an unusual thing for a young, wealthy child to learn, right? I mean, we're actually sort of coming to the end of the Age of Enlightenment. A lot of these Enlightenment thinkers are very well established, so to have a rich young man be taught some of these figures, not incredibly unusual, but like I said, not standard either.
Venezuela, and indeed the whole Spanish Empire, was in upheaval. Race revolts and independence movements cropped up and were crushed, each time with more brutality, but each time exposing Spain's ever-slipping hold.
Yeah.
Simon's tutor was caught up in one of these revolts and sentenced to permanent exile, and so again Simon was alone. Soon he was enrolled in the local military academy.
Though I will say, that type of education was not unusual but not standard. I do have to remember, I'm thinking from more in like Anglo-French perspective, and we're talking about the Spanish Empire at this point, and Spain was one of the more authoritarian and repressive European powers, compared to, someone like Britain or, I mean, of course, the United States, but we're getting a little later into the era at this point where we have a United States. Though it's not black and white. Like, sometimes you see the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire characterized as altogether different, completely different from, say, the British Empire. You'll find commonalities, right? The difference wasn't so immense, but there certainly was difference. And especially in terms of this Enlightenment ideology, it was more often censored in Spain than it was in Britain. So I guess there probably was maybe less access. So maybe I have to revise my statement about that education. Though, I mean, even among, the elites of Spain and the Spanish Empire, a lot of them were familiar with Enlightenment literature. They got their hands on it, whether they were supposed to or not. And of course, we're talking about the colonies here, so the grip of the Spanish crown was looser than back on the peninsula, back in mainland Spain. I mean, that's one of the features of these wars of independence, is that the Spanish grip continues to loosen. So maybe there was more access to this sort of circulating Enlightenment information. I'm not an expert on the topic.
By an uncle. He chafed at the discipline, but learned much about the art of making war. Soon, though, he was shipped off again, this time to Spain. But he wanted this adventure. He was excited to see the continent that he'd heard so much about, the place where the ideas he so admired came from. But even on this trip, he got a taste of the declining nature of Spanish power. For when his ship stopped in Mexico City, they were informed that they wouldn't be able to depart right away because of a British blockade. Eventually, though, he did make it to Spain, and then on to Madrid, where he would finally get his first real education. And there, too, he met his first great love. Her name was Maria Teresa, and she was from another respectable Caracan family. But unlike Simon, she had been born in Spain and spent her whole life there. He soon proposed to her, and after working for a year...
Hey, Simon's marrying upwards.
...to convince her father, they were married in Madrid. Now blissfully married, he decided it was time to return to Caracas and take his place in the family affairs together with his new wife. So they set off for the New World. For Simon, this was a return home. For Maria, it was an opportunity to see her family seat for the first time. But as they landed in Caracas, she began to feel ill, and then weak. Within 5 months, she was dead.
Yeah, this is not an unusual event. You have Europeans who make their way out to the New World, to the Americas, and then get hit by a barrage of previously unfamiliar diseases. Diseases that their bodies are really not used to, and they fall very ill and oftentimes die. Of course, this was particularly bad in the more tropical areas of the Americas, some parts of Latin America, the Caribbean in particular. We see a lot of this with Europeans being sent to Haiti, for example. They get very sick very quickly. So, tragic, but definitely not unusual.
Yellow fever had taken Simon's first
Ah,
love.
yeah.
He tried to stay in Venezuela to manage the life he had inherited, but everything there reminded him only of her. And so, within a year, in 1803, he once again boarded a ship for Spain. But Spain, too, and especially Madrid, only served as a constant reminder of Maria. So when all non-residents were suddenly ordered out of the capital because there wasn't enough bread to feed them, Simon planned a trip for Paris.
Well, at this point, we're in the midst of the, French Revolutionary into Napoleonic Wars. So Spain is finding itself occupied at times on both sides of the conflict. At times an ally of France fighting against France. I mean, it's a it's a long period of a lot of complicated fighting, but the whole continent's beginning to get wrapped up in this conflict.
There he saw an empire reinvigorated by revolution. He couldn't help but contrast it with Madrid. Here was a city and a nation modernizing, evolving, growing with new republican ideals. He drank it in.
Yeah.
He was enchanted by Paris and the promise it offered. But it was here that he found his second heartbreak. Not at the hands of a woman, but of a man. Napoleon.
Yeah.
Simon had seen Napoleon as a beacon of hope, as the new man, a
Yeah,
true
there's sort of a famous story associated with Simon's time in Paris that I wonder if we'll hear.
republican serving his state faithfully, guiding a state by his soul and humble wisdom towards liberty, equality, and brotherhood. But then Napoleon placed a crown upon his head. Losing his temper one night at a dinner, Simon railed against Napoleon's vanity, his hubris, his lust for power. This suddenly made him much less welcome in social circles, and his friends, seeing the toll the debaucherous life of Paris had taken on him, decided that it was time for a change. They packed up and took him.
Yeah, there's sort of a little story of Simon Bolivar that I'm not sure if it was on Napoleon's coronation or a celebration of Napoleon or something like that he basically retreated to his room, shut all the windows, and locked himself in because he was so upset that Napoleon, who he had seen as a great Republican idol, had crowned himself a monarch. I mean, this was sort of a disappointing event for a lot of liberals across Europe and across the world, of course. France had been... It's sort of interesting. I mean, France had been a beacon of Republican ideology, though, of course, France had gone through a lot of serious violence and unrest, and a lot of the sheen had really rubbed off after the first few years of the revolution. So a lot of the people who had supported the revolution in 1789 had already left, but some of the remaining sort of stout Republicans found themselves disgusted by Napoleon, making himself an emperor, making himself a monarch. They felt he had abandoned the revolution. Of course, Simon Bolivar is one of those liberals who found himself very disappointed, though, of course, Napoleon also found many admirers for a variety of different reasons. Look, we talk about Napoleon enough on this channel. He's a complicated guy, and there were a lot of different reactions. But apparently, Simon in particular was very disappointed. And of course, they brought Napoleon up, so I reckon they'll probably make the comparison throughout the series. I'm sure we'll have several points where you can compare the trajectory of Simon to that of Napoleon, because in some ways they're very similar, but in some ways they are different. I won't say too much now. That's sort of something for later in Bolivar's life, but something interesting to think about.
him to Italy. And it was here, in this reinvigorating place rich with history, that Simon's thoughts and ambitions really took form. It was here on the very hill which plebeian Romans had retired to win their rights over 2,000 years ago that Simon stood and proclaimed that he would not rest until his homeland was free. Soon he departed Europe.
Like every sort of educated Enlightenment era individual, Simon was a big fan of the classics, like many people were. Like I said, if you were frankly an educated person in this era, you were probably a big fan of the ancient Romans and the Greeks. I mean, there was this whole fascination with the ancients sweeping across the Americas and Europe during this time. So Simon, finds himself among a lot of people again.
Europe to head back home. But first he stopped briefly in the United
Hey!
States. Here too he was inspired. He would later say that it was the first time he'd seen a rational democracy in action. But he realized it had its differences, that it would be no template for the revolution he intended. And so, at last...
That was his opinion. This is something probably that we'll also talk about throughout this series, is that Simon, he was respected in the United States, and he was a great admirer of the revolution, and he certainly liked a lot of things about the United States government. He felt not all of it would work for Latin America. Some people in Latin America agreed with him, some people disagreed. Of course, following and during these wars of independence, one of the great debates in Latin America was, okay, well, what form of government are we going to take on? And we'll see someone's opinions on that, I'm sure, later in the series.
In 1807, at the age of 23, he set foot again in Caracas, filled with dreams, ambitions, and an ardent desire for liberation and independence for his people. He walked the streets of his long-neglected home and wondered what the future might bring. Join us next time and find out exactly what that future brings.
All right. I had a good time with this episode. I yapped a lot. I won't apologize for that, because that's what I do on this channel. If you don't like it, you should probably just go watch the original video. And you should watch the original video regardless. I will link it down below. You should go and give Extra History a like. Go and subscribe. Show him support for making these types of videos. But yeah, I talked a lot during this one. Age of Revolutions fascinates me. And also, the type of history I do a lot on the early United States and early national Haiti and a lot of late 18th century into early 19th century. So this is kind of my era, not necessarily Latin America, but I have a lot of stuff to say about this time period, and I do find it absolutely fascinating. I hope you guys do as well. If you enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.